Good evening, everybody. I especially want to thank our gorgeous hostess, Lilia, for inviting me. I'm here in Ukraine for the first time ever. And the topic I've chosen is rather technical for a woman. It's technological challenges in the development of distributed ledger technology. And I chose this one to push myself to read all the technical papers that I had been lazy reading about. The first question we all should be pondering about, being in the blockchain field, is the question of whether we prefer centralization to decentralization, right? Whether we as a society are ready, are we evolved citizens, are we self-trusting communities to be able to self-govern, and whether we are prepared for decentralization. So if you look at some of the proponents of blockchain, the very preeminent leaders, you would find them saying that centralization as an architecture is antithetical to the principles and interest of society in general. And therefore, they believe that decentralization will garner much more support because it is philanthropic, open source is more philanthropic, and anything to do with patents or protection of intellectual property rights is against the interests of society, and therefore, anything favoring the interests of society should have a lot more support. So therefore, we believe that cryptocurrencies, which are basically decentralization, would have much more support from the communities and therefore would represent the future. So if you look at the origin of Bitcoin, if you guess, what was Satoshi's motivation when he invented Bitcoin, I doubt it was to invent a currency that he wanted to send something to some obscure countries, or he wanted to buy something, on a secret marketplace and so on. It was none of those. And I believe Satoshi's invention, the motive behind Satoshi's invention, was a kind of an intellectual protest against the principles of centralization, against the exercise of authority, control, big intermediaries, or governments, or regulators, so to speak. So to give you one example, in India we had one of the biggest arguments against centralization. So one fine day last year, our Prime Minister came and announced on national television that within a few hours, we are going to completely take out, make illegal the currency denomination, which is one of the most popular notes, the 500 rupee notes and the 1000 rupee notes. So of course the rich who had nothing to lose went with their stacks of money, and they raided the malls, the designer malls, and stocked up on all the luxury items like jewelry and designer brands and stuff. But the poor people who had some savings, like some of the beggars who had just 2 notes as their lifetime savings, and some of the daily wage laborers, they would depend on getting a few currency notes as their daily wage labor. They had a lot to lose. And over the next 3 months, there was tremendous chaos that was unleashed throughout the country. We had people dying in queues because those who had never come out, never went to the banks, they had to go and stand in queues because there was withdrawal limits of like very minimal amounts. It was unbelievable chaos, unprecedented. And it had to take somebody really callous, someone who really had zero empathy with people to impose such a thing on a large population, on an undeveloped country like India. But it happened. You can argue as to what the motivations of the leader were, but it happened, and it is the perfect example of centralization or authority or control or top-down approach. And decentralization of Bitcoin is completely against this. So of course the denouement was that Indians were not very familiar with Bitcoin. So there was a very small percentage of Indians who were familiar with Bitcoin. And of course, the Bitcoin price shot up very dramatically in India because of demonetization, because people were trying to shift their assets from the currency notes. Those who had hoarded a lot of black money or any other form of wealth which was not declared, they were trying to shift the assets to different categories like stocks and gold and so on. And all of these categories shot up in prices, including the Bitcoin. So just to give you that example. So this was a short plug on what we are going to do. We had Vitalik in India last December for the first time. We did a big blockchain conference in New Delhi, and he's coming again to India this summer. We are having a big week of activities because Vitalik wants to develop the Ethereum community, and he wants to encourage research efforts, and he wants to facilitate India's movement towards blockchain. So now coming to the topic of the technological challenges in blockchain. So the biggest challenge that everybody is grappling with, so before I go to the challenges, I'm probably much less technical than any of you Ukrainians because I know that all the developers are here. But I'm still being brave and courageous to speak because I've had the benefit of asking some direct questions to Vitalik and Charles Hoskinson and these kind of people who have invented a lot of stuff. So the first challenge everybody is grappling with is scalability. This essentially means that once people try to improve on the Bitcoin protocol, the first blockchain protocol, which was Ethereum, is limited to 15 transactions per second, which is woefully inadequate compared to what we should be desiring, which is something like 100,000 transactions per second. And that is because there are thousands of applications running on Ethereum, and there are millions of users at any time. But going from 15 to 100,000 is a significant challenge and might take many, many years. And why is this a challenge? Because blockchain, as a definition, works in such a way that every single node has to process every single transaction. That means there is a bottleneck. So the speed of the blockchain network is capped or limited by the speed that any single node can process the transactions. The network cannot process faster than any single node can process any of the transactions. And then mathematically, there is something called Amdahl's law, which says that not everything is scalable. And there should always be a compromise or a trade-off. So one always has to think about what is a network ready to compromise in order to have scalability? What is it willing to give up in order to be scalable? So there are a few solutions that people are working on, and the most popular one is sharding. And by sharding, so if there are lots of nodes in blockchain, what sharding means is you randomly select some nodes, because earlier in the traditional blockchain network, every node was processing every transaction, and here you select a few nodes to process transactions in parallel. So some nodes will process some transactions, the other nodes will process other transactions, and these nodes are selected at random. So therefore, not all the nodes are processing all the transactions, and therefore the capacity is unlocked. And the power of the network increases as you increase the number of nodes. That's the basic principle behind sharding. But even to implement sharding, it will take many years. This is what the Ethereum guys are estimating. And some other companies are also working on, a lot of researchers are working on alternative protocols. One of them is called the Lumino Transaction Compression Protocol. This has been invented by the Rootstock guys, the RSK Labs guys. Sergio Lerner, who is a very learned man, he's come up with this. And LTCP protocol basically makes the network much faster. So for example, the Bitcoin network can be taken up to 100 transactions per second with the LTCP protocol, and it makes many more on-chain transactions possible than is traditionally possible by the blockchain. Okay, the next biggest challenge is governance. So you all have been hearing about the DAO problem and the hard forks and people having consensus or not about it and so on. So if the central idea behind a blockchain is decentralization, and then if a coterie of people is deciding, what the principles that dictate the working of the protocol are, then essentially it's a dichotomy, right? It's a dilemma because it's not decentralization anymore. You're still vesting some control or some authority with a handful of people. So the governance poses questions like, how long do we keep hard forking? Like, do we keep hard forking in public settings all the time? Because there will always be bugs and there will always be problems that you have not addressed before. And if the solution is hard fork, do you keep on hard forking? And then, which contracts are legally binding? So the smart contracts platform or the blockchain is based on the premise that code is law. And then if code is law and then you hard fork and you say that whatever we coded earlier has to change to something else, then who is deciding that code is no longer law or intention is law? So basically there are these kind of moral dilemmas behind these hard forks. And dispute resolution. So if there is a smart contract and if there is problems in interpretation of what was intended and what is transpiring later, then how do you resolve those disputes? And then who calls the shots in the community? These are all governance issues which are also there in the existing systems. So the point is, even if you move on to decentralization, you have these issues still. These issues which are characteristic of the centralized systems. Then interoperability and standardization. This is a key problem because if you look at the existing banking and financial institutions, you have big behemoth organizations like SWIFT. What is SWIFT? SWIFT is a creation of a lot of banks and financial institutions which came together and formed this so that they can have a monopoly on the banking system. So for example, SWIFT is nothing but a few standards on messaging protocol, as to how to communicate from one region to the other. And then, so actually there is not much of physical labor or not much of effort that is being expended in transferring money across borders or something. But because SWIFT is a private collaboration of all these banks, they can extract rents from the society. But it is an important thing because SWIFT is a central authority, it is trusted upon and it is relied upon. So similarly in blockchain also, even when we move to decentralized systems, we need to have similar protocols because we need to have the correct understanding of the terms. So if I enter into a smart contract with an Ukrainian, you should not interpret the smart contract to be any different than what I intended it to be. Otherwise, the smart contracts in London will be different, smart contracts in India will be different, and in Ukraine will be different. And then we don't move on to a worldwide, Internet 2 or Windows 2 kind of a thing. So if you look at blockchain as an upgrade of the Internet, like Internet 2, then it means that all of us should be on the same page. All of us should have the same understanding of the system and so on. So currently there are some standardization efforts happening. For example, the WC3 and the Internet Experts Task Force, IETF, Interledger, Hyperledger, and then now the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance as well. So with all these alliances taking shape, there are expected to be standards emerging where we will have much more interoperability. So if you don't have interoperability, the banks can use the blockchains, private blockchains, to increase their own efficiencies and so on. But the moment they have to interact with some other institution, these standards will be required. And then the threat of quantum computing. So recently the SHA-1 was broken, right? So in February, okay. So, okay, so I prepared much longer than this, but let me quickly. So I was just saying that the SHA-1 was broken in February 2017. So if quantum computing makes so much leaps that SHA-256 gets broken, then the entire cryptography premise on which the blockchain is based will have to be reinvented. But then we also have intellectual juggernauts like Vitalik amongst us, so if such problems are on the horizon, then I'm sure that solutions will be found. Then we have, then we have a lot of other problems like latency and user interface security, energy efficiency, for which proof of stake is the solution, then programmability versus privacy. I'm just quickly running because there's little time. And these are some of the Ethereum's approaches to various problems. I'm jumping to privacy because it's one of the important problems. So there are now some low-tech solutions, and then there are some high-tech solutions. So there are 4 to 5 low-tech privacy solutions. One of them is one-time payment addresses. This is something similar to what PayPal had used when it came in the beginning. So basically, you mask the identity of the sender and the receiver, but you just send the transaction details. So the problem with this is the transaction is still obvious to everybody. But you also have to generate each pair for every transaction, which is also cumbersome. So then the next solution is mixing and tumbling, which is used in various things like Bitcoin mix, Bitcoin fog, bit mixes, coin join, coin shuffle, and these kind of things. The problem is where regulator requires you to have KYC and AML, or where a provenance is required for a transaction. This is not suitable because what you're doing is all the senders, whatever they send, you put it in a pot of money, and then all the receivers, whatever they have to get, you send it from this pot of money. So no one knows, who is sending to whom. They just receive the money they ought to receive, and they just send the money they ought to send. Some other low-tech solutions restrict read access to blockchain, which is not really ideal because blockchain can be leaked and then everything becomes public. And side channels and payment channels are very popular because a lot of protocols are using this at the moment. But still, you have to disclose the opening and closing balances in this. And some sensitive information you can store off-chain. This again defeats the purpose of the blockchain, because blockchain by definition is a single source of truth. But if you store most of the sensitive information outside of the blockchain, again you're vesting the power to control information in a centralized authority, which goes against the premises of blockchain. And then coming to the high-tech solutions, you have 4. One is the stealth addresses. Stealth addresses, the sender creates a stealth address for the receiver using his public key. And this was first used in dark wallet on top of the Bitcoin protocol. And then you have Pedersen commitments. In Pedersen commitments, you basically hide the data and you just commit to a hash. And then if you want, you can also add the blinding factor to the hash. If the data correlating to the hash is very small, you add a blinding factor, just like some dummy inputs. And then finally you reveal the blinding factor and the hash, and the receiver then correlates it to, and then the receiver verifies whether this hash corresponds to the information they received earlier. So this is Pedersen commitment, and this was originally used by Greg Maxwell. And then ring signatures. In ring signatures, there are a few rings, there are a few keys, and 2 keys are selected to create a signature. You don't know which 2 keys were used, but you can verify that the keys within this ring were used. And ring signatures are popular, so Ethereum will be using it, and I think Monero also uses it. And this was first used in a protocol called CryptoNote. And then ZK snarks are the most popular. These are being used by Zcash, and as you know, the price of Zcash has been rallying in the recent past. And ZK snarks, which is zero knowledge, some interactive arguments of knowledge. So these are basically a very major invention in the blockchain technology, which are used by Zcash, and then this can also be used on top of Ethereum and so on, where without having to reveal the whole information, you can verify that a transaction has taken place, or you can ensure that the transaction is valid. So I'm just going to give one example. So let's imagine I'm sending a courier to somebody. And if I want to verify whether the courier has been sent or not, I have to first show the invoice saying, you know, I'm the sender and the receiver is so-and-so and his address is so-and-so. And these are the contents of the courier. I have to reveal everything, right? The transaction, the sender and the receiver. But if there was a process where you can verify that the courier was sent, you know, so-and-so number courier was sent without having to reveal either the sender or the receiver or the contents. You know, zero knowledge proof is something similar to that, and this is currently the most popular technology being used by a lot of companies. So I'm jumping, so I've skipped a lot of content because we are out of time. I just wanted to tell you about what sort of blockchain solutions the Indian companies are working on. Most of them are working on the data storage, information validation and data verification kind of problems. And they're also working on digital identity and a lot of Bitcoin exchanges and cross-border foreign remittances and so on. So myself, you know, we are trying to, so I represent Zero Field Labs, and we are partnering with Vitalik and Ethereum to promote Ethereum in India. And we want to build blockchain proof of concepts for banks and financial institutions, and probably also build a consortium of banking in India in line with the enterprise alliances that I talked to you about earlier, because interoperability and standardization is very much required for the offtake of blockchain.